So we're talking about food and health and diet today, Charlotte, aren't we? It's been cold a couple of weeks ago, a lot of snow and ice, which reminded me of some defrosting attempts that have been happening within the team recently. Martin, our producer, had an epic fail at trying to defrost a bolognese by putting it in the oven and melting the plastic container around it, which again reminded me of my dad that used to defrost the Christmas turkey by putting it in a warm bucket of water. So my question to you is, it's healthy, isn't it? Yeah. What's the worst kitchen fail that you've had?
I'm hugely fortunate. My husband does all the cooking. He used to be a chef. Actually, I can tell you a failure. I made an absolutely amazing toad in the hole, perfect rise. You've never seen Yorkshire pudding like it. And then we were like, okay, we're going to have some friends over. So why don't I make this, considering I never cook? It was flatter than flat. I swear it went out the oven with a smaller volume than it went in.
Hello, welcome to Agonomics with David Udall. I'm David Udall, if you hadn't already guessed. AHDB created the title for the show. My name just so happened to match, and the rest is history. Anyway, if you're like a virgin to what we do, a beautiful stranger even, then let me explain. This podcast is all about looking at the economics of agriculture, from the farm gate to the plate. We always champion British produce, so when it comes to steaks, don't cry for me, Argentina. In this episode, our focus is on young consumers, Gen Z, to understand their attitudes towards health and how red meat and dairy fit into their meal choices. You may think we get hung up on this generation as we do a lot of research, but they're an important demographic, and understanding where they get inspiration from can help us all. To discuss this, I'm joined by my colleague Charlotte Forkes-Rees, a retail and consumer insight analyst. Please follow or subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. New shows drop every Wednesday at midday. And please get in touch. Comment on any of AHDB's social channels or email us agonomics@ahdb.org.uk. So it's January. We've had some pretty rubbish weather with it being wet and snowing, and everyone is in that mode of wanting to feel healthy and happy, which is kind of why we're talking about health and impacts of social media in this podcast. But at AHDB, we've also released some other work recently exploring health food trends. In our latest Pulse survey that we carry out with YouGov, 90% of consumers stated that diet was important, which kind of, you'd kind of expect, wouldn't you, really? I'm more worried about the 10% that says that diet is not important. I don't really want to know what they're eating. 86% said fitness was important in contributing to their overall health, and I'd say health and mental health as well as part of that. And within that group, almost half regularly exercise 3 times per week or more, which is interesting. How many times a week do I exercise? I play squash with my friend Dan, who's far better at squash than me. So when I say I play squash, what I mean is I lose at squash regularly. But it keeps me healthy. Anyway, around half of consumers who believe diet and fitness are important are planning to increase their exercise levels in 2025. We're all going to say that in January. Let's just come back and find out in March, April, May what they've done, if they've carried on with that. Obviously, from an economics perspective, something that's very clear that during times of financial strain, cost is a key barrier to healthy eating as consumers prioritise household bills and those everyday essentials. And an interesting thing that we've found out is that when consumers are looking for a healthy meal, it is more expensive, around just over £2 for that meal, than one when they're not looking for health as a priority within that, where the meal is actually cheaper at £1.45, which then kind of brings us back to a big kind of circular economy view of the world and going, actually, cheaper food is generally probably more highly processed, because that's part of the ways in that it is cheaper, because it's economically more efficient to do it. You get economies of scale, but it does create health issues. And therefore, if you're wanting to do things like fix the NHS, for instance, you've got to start at the base and change consumer habits and change society and culture versus just trying to pump more money in at the other end. So it's an interesting kind of policy decision there around how to improve health and diet. And we're going to be talking about that today with Charlotte, where we're going to be talking about the Gen Z, never quite sure which. We'll find out which. Obviously, they're going to be a huge consumer group going forwards and that changing consumer demand. But before we get into that, let's not forget that we do have a mystery music act for this week. I've already been slipping in a few song titles so far, and we will reveal their identity at the end of the show. I think I'd be surprised if it's borderline if you get this one. I think it's been pretty obvious. Charlotte, so welcome to the podcast. We are here to talk about health, diet, Gen Z, new consumers coming through, the impact on red meat and dairy consumption. But before we get into the depth of it, starting with the basics, because I'm pretty basic and, I need this explanation. Who, what, when, why, Gen Z, what do we actually mean by that?
Yeah, so Gen Z refers to what we're going to call as an age demographic, and it's for people that were born between 1997 and around about 2012. So currently in the UK, that refers to about 10 million people. And why is it so important? Well, because actually they are the shopper of the future. So Barclays are estimating that by 2030, they're going to be responsible for around about 11% of retail spend domestically.
So that's interesting, actually, because if you think about that age range of those years of being born, sort of 97 to 2012, that's quite a big age range of like 15 years. So that's kind of putting consumers of anywhere from low teens through to starting late 20s kind of thing. Let's say 13 to 28 as a broad range. And the interesting thing there is that's a huge range of people. 10 million is a big number of population as well. And within that, there's obviously going to be quite a few people that are regular shoppers, people that are within jobs, starting jobs, leaving university, etc. People at university, again, different in terms of like income and finance. And then people who are most likely still living at home and therefore would potentially be influencing their wider family habits with the choices that they make. So it's a very interesting demographic in terms of that age range because of the different stages of their life within that. Oh, I'm getting quite deep there, aren't I?
Yeah, no, it is a really interesting demographic. And when you also think about what they've lived through, like even just taking the last sort of 5 years, what they had, a global pandemic, a recession, there's been huge amounts of things which were going to be impacting their choices that me as a millennial, I didn't really have to deal with until, I was quite an established adult. So there's going to be lots of things which will have influenced how they are going to be shopping going forward into the future as well.
I like the way you describe yourself as an established adult. I think I'm still looking to get to that phase, despite being married and having a 4-year-old and a mortgage and all that kind of rubbish. I am definitely not an established adult. And as I said before we started this podcast, as I'm sitting here drinking from my son's sippy cup bottle because he's at preschool and it keeps my water slightly warmer for me, definitely not an established adult. But I'm glad that one of us is on this podcast. And it's, you mentioned something really interesting there about things that they've lived through. Obviously, like COVID pandemic, but then the impact of the conflict of, war in Ukraine, people coming out of university into that high food inflation period, that high inflation period, their income spend would be immediately impacted in their, the infancy of their adult life, if that isn't too demeaning of a way to put it. But they've gone into that kind of like consumer habit at a very extreme point. So again, a very interesting demographic. So anyway, we've spoken a lot about demographic there, and you even mentioned millennials. Let's not even start getting that into the mix. But specifically about Gen Z, I mean, how important is health to them, and what does health mean to them?
Interestingly, we do see that quite often people will think about Gen Z and that they are going to be very much more interested in health than perhaps older demographics. And actually, if we look into what people are claiming, broadly, those that are saying that they are always eating healthily, never eat unhealthily, through to those that are trying their best to eat healthy, but they are having those regular unhealthy foods. Gen Z and the total adult population are quite similar. So you see about 85% of Gen Z falling within that, and 86% of the total population But where they do differ is where those that are always claiming to eat healthily and very rarely having unhealthy food, Gen Z are more than or almost twice as likely to claim that compared to your average adult population. So health is very much priority for some of Gen Z.
That's an interesting one. That's kind of like a big generational shift, isn't it? And again, thinking of those points in people's lives, I suppose, as it were, what we're really talking about here is kind of like a longer term change in health attitudes and how that's going to build for a long term, that people will be set in their values are set relatively early in their life, especially within that age range we're talking about, those ones that are still in those mid-teens. This is where their values and their kind of understanding of the world becomes set. They may have that same structure in terms of their health requirements and want of healthy food continually, and that will then get passed on to the next generation. So it is probably a point where they could be, even from a societal point of view, quite a significant shift from our AHDB perspective, from our levy payer perspective, and from an agriculture perspective. I think the big question is, what impact do we think that health change and that health view is going to have, specifically on their red meat and dairy consumption, because they're the two areas that obviously get a significant amount of headlines in terms of positive about food. I remember there was a story recently about drinking a glass of milk a day reducing the risk of bowel cancer as well, but also there's still a lot of negative health headlines about them as well. So what does all that mean for their consumption of those sectors?
Well, actually, I'm going to throw something back to you, which is maybe not to do with this question, but if I was going to say to you, tell me what you think a healthy diet is, if someone said to you, what is health, what would you instantly think of? Because you're not Gen Z, are you, David? Just putting it out there.
Whoa. Why do you think I'm not? What is giving you that impression? Is it the general haggard look that I have? I'm not. I don't know what I am. I'm 30. I'll be 38 this year. What am I?
You're millennial.
Am I?
Yeah. So that's 1980 to 1996.
Oh wow!
It's millennial.
Oh, I never knew that. Hey, I've learned something. So my view on healthy food would be, I think, do you know what? It's probably different having the 4-year-old as I do, because it changes your view of kind of what healthy food is. I'm constantly thinking about he shouldn't be eating that. So I'm guessing less processed food is probably the thing. Self-cooking. We've always kind of cooked within our household. I've always kind of cooked. My wife does. I'm not married to a chef, and neither is my wife. She's not married. I'm not a chef. But yeah, cooking from scratch probably is what we describe as healthy food, I'd say.
Okay, it's interesting because I grew up with seeing Special K diets. Do you remember seeing that at all on packs?
Yeah.
Having Special K for breakfast, lunch, and then a salad or something in the evening. So if someone was going to say, what would I consider, I'd want to maybe avoid or include within my diet, I'd say low fats, I'd say low salt, that type of thing. Whereas actually, if you look at Gen Z, they look at it the other way around. So health to them is about food is a fuel. So we see about half of Gen Z think that, or strongly agreeing that food is important to them because they need it for energy. And we see that they are significantly less likely to be concerned about salt, sugar, fat content of their food compared to the rest of the adult population. But they'll think that health will be high protein, or it'll be about the vitamins and minerals that are included within their diet. And that is actually when it really plays into the favour of red meat and dairy being included within it. So it's just very interesting seeing those attitudinal shifts, because my perception of health, perhaps a little bit maybe like you, is what you shouldn't be having, whereas theirs is what you should be having. It's just an interesting viewpoint that they then take in it, I think, that is quite different between actually not too different in ages.
I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but in terms of the way that gets communicated is really important. And obviously within our We Eat Balanced campaign, there was an active promotion of vitamin B12 within red meat and the energy that provides, etc. as well. So it's really interesting. I've never really thought about it in this context before.
But what's really important, I think, from this different perception around what should be included in diets is actually that red meat and dairy is really important. So we see that 99% of shoppers who are aged under 28 actually purchase meat, fish or poultry, and 98% of shoppers under 34 are purchasing cow's dairy. While a lot of people think that perhaps younger consumers are more likely to be vegetarian or vegan or restricting animal proteins that they're having within their diet, actually research by Mintel has shown that those aged 19 to 22, almost a fifth of those who had been vegetarian or vegan have stopped, and almost half of those were saying that they didn't think the diet was healthy for them, which is why they then incorporated animal proteins back into their diet. So younger consumers, your Gen Zs, are very aware of how important these products are for them, which is great news for our levy payers, because it is showing that there is demand still there. And what we see as well is that, like we were saying, you know, the functionality of the food and Gen Z being aware of the association with red meat and being a good source of omega-3 fatty acids compared with the total population. And they're also less likely to believe that red meat should be eaten in moderation. They're really aware that beef, pork and lamb are really good sources of protein, and that for dairy, almost 2/3 of Gen Z agree that they're a great source of vitamin B12 and calcium. So really well-known health benefits of those products seen.
So that's a positive, ray of light on the demand side, then, isn't it, of our equation? Because obviously we're going to see some. As long as, I think the key thing, and again we'll talk about it in a bit, as long as it's communicated correctly that the red meat and dairy products have those attributes and have those minerals, vitamins, and positive things, and people understand that, and it's packaged correctly and people understand how to cook it, then it is a positive sense that people do see the health value. And as you say, that move away from, I suppose, that older style of calorie counting, fat, salt content seems to have moved out, and people are focusing on the actual content of what the goodness is within the product. It's really interesting. Thanks, Charlotte.
We're also seeing the way that they're shopping, though, is slightly different. So while we're seeing that virtually all Gen Z are purchasing red meat and dairy, retail data is saying that they are purchasing less, but this isn't that they're leaving the category. They are just changing how they are incorporating it into their diet. So it's more like your cuisine-based cooking. Your Indians, your Italians, where meat isn't necessarily the focus of that meal. It's an ingredient within it, and they're less likely to have your stews, but they do love a roast dinner.
Well, we all love a roast dinner, don't we? So,
yeah.
That's surely that's just a given in any generational diet, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, let's end on a positive there then. We're going to take a short break to get the latest in the markets. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about where Gen Z get their information from, social media, and what we at AHDB do with all of this information.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy, and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episode you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 6th of January. Despite some support in wheat markets over the Christmas period, prices have been under pressure in the new year from a strengthening US dollar, technical selling and sluggish global demand. However, Russian wheat crop conditions remain in focus, with warmer than usual temperatures and excess moisture in key growing regions. Persistent hot and dry weather in Argentina is also raising concern over the country's maize crop, which is now in its critical development stage. For rapeseed, new crop prices are supported, with doubts over prospects for global rapeseed production in 2025, though forecasts of heavy soybean supplies from South America limit any major price increases. Over the next few weeks, weather in major exporting countries such as South America and Russia will be key in driving prices. The USDA will also release updated global supply and demand estimates at the end of this week. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
Welcome back to Agonomics. We are here with Charlotte from our retail and consumer team talking about Gen Z, health impact of social media. We're going to talk about social media now, and I'm borderline if I'm actually looking forward to this next section, because Charlotte has warned me she's going to ask me some more questions. So I'm sorry if we just reduce this down to, I don't know, like 4 minutes to try and make it as quick as possible. I'm going to be hoping like a prayer that I don't get any awkward questions from you, Charlotte. But my first question to you to kick off with is, we've been talking about Gen Z and their health and their diet and their insight that they use to drive their decisions. But where do they get that information from to start that process?
It's probably not a surprise, but social media is hugely, hugely influential to them. So we see that about 2/3 of those aged 10 to 22 claim to hear about food and drink on social media, and that 70% of your Gen Z are using social media for inspiration, compared to around just about half of the total population. Now, my question to you is, what kind of social media do you use? I'm not going to stalk you, I promise, but it's just, it is interesting to see the differences.
I don't honestly use social media.
LinkedIn then?
I've got a LinkedIn account, yeah, which I generally use only to pretty much promote this podcast. LinkedIn's just for recruitment agents to do an easy job for them, though, isn't it, basically? And for people to pretend they're showing off about their vision and mission at work, not to be too cynical about it, in the way that my conspiracy theory about Fitbits, that no one told you about counting your steps until someone could sell you the watch to count them, never mattered, did it, until you needed the watch. Then all of a sudden it's a thing. Anyway, social media conspiracy theories aside, I honestly don't use social media. I think I've got a Facebook account, but I've probably not accessed it for like 10 years. I gave up using Twitter and stuff just because I kind of didn't really like it. So I genuinely, other than promoting this podcast on LinkedIn, I don't use social media, I'm afraid.
Very interesting.
Am I bad? Am I wrong?
No, my ones would probably be Instagram would be my favourite. And I am going to pull in producer Martin for this then. Producer Martin, do you use social media?
Well, as a Generation X? Yeah, no, I do. I'm still sort of Facebook. Twitter or X just went into a bit of a spiral of chaos over the last year or two, and I'm not really with that too much. LinkedIn, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I got the job that I have. So big thumbs up to that particular platform. But yeah, I'd probably say I'm more old school with the Facebook. So I remember it coming about, being a thing, thinking never catch on, and yeah, I got swept up with it.
We just send each other carrier pigeons, Martin, don't we? Why would you stop doing that?
Yeah, so interestingly, I think that is then relatively representative that, yeah, your Gen X's would be your Facebook. Your millennials are going to be, I'm going to ignore you, David, in this one, but they're going to be your Instagram. But your Gen Z is going to be TikTok. Is going to be a massive one for them. They do also like your Instagram and Pinterest. Now, we see that actually in our most recent trust and traceability research, which we conducted at AHDB with Blue Marble, it showed that social media has a really strong influence on Gen Z. So 55% reporting that they use TikTok for information about food, which obviously neither of you would perhaps have thought of using, would you? That wouldn't have been your first choice.
No, I mean, is there a Delia cookbook on TikTok? Because that would be my normal place for food. Sure.
But yeah, that just shows how different it is between the generations of where they're going to be going to look for their information. So we see that actually social media ranks as the top source for hearing something about red meat or dairy for your Gen Zs. But it is significantly less, so about 27 percentage points less for the general population.
Here's a question back then. This is like question competition now, isn't it, Charlotte?
Yeah.
Is that for recipe ideas, or is that for like nutritional health information, or and as well as that, is that sort of the just understanding of like production systems, etc. So what kind of information are they looking for from that social media?
Bit of everything, really. So inspiration, your food trends, really important. So I'm going to say you won't have seen this, but just before Christmas there was a trend going around for cucumber salads. That was a massive one that was going around for your Gen Zs.
Hold on. Well, I don't often interrupt people on this podcast, but I'm going to stop you there. There was a trend for cucumber salads. Welcome 1972 back into the picture. Surely we've been here before. That's not a trend. That's called history, isn't it?
Well, all trends are sort of cyclical, aren't they? But, what I would say, I think is slightly more on brand for us. There was a blue cheese martini trend that was going around. So infusing vodka with blue cheese to make your martinis. We'll have to see whether that comes out in the retail data, won't we? If we've suddenly got a spike in your under 28s purchasing blue cheeses over the Christmas period.
Me and Martin are looking at each other thinking, yeah, we're more of the Jamie Vardy Skittles vodka era than blue cheese, aren't we?
But we do see that it isn't just for what should I be making. It is also around information. So is it good for me to have? Should I be including this within my diet? It is also a source. So we see that social media that promotes the healthy eating is found to be inspirational or aspirational for 75% of 16 to 34-year-olds. Social media is used for everything really for them. So not only just your inspiration, but also their food choices and finding out about their food choices.
We've been joking and having it a bit of fun here, but this is a serious message around the long-term demand profile for red meat and dairy. And this is one of those things where we've spoken previously about the supply side, and towards the end of 24, we released our work looking at the outlook to 2030 for the supply side for red meat, which was showing dwindling supplies. And recently on the podcast, we spoke about, the historic lows since the sort of mid-late 90s for both the sheep flock and the cattle herd as well. So from the supply side, we're seeing things tighten. And what we're really saying here is from a demand perspective, one of the key things that can stimulate supply is stronger demand, helps to increase the price and therefore helps to incentivize farmers to produce more. And if there is this generational shift changing, and if this is a generational shift, whilst there is still, we're not just focusing solely on a demographic, saying that it is the only consumer out there. There is a range of consumers. And obviously we spoke about halal being important to the market in the podcast last year with Vanessa as well. What we're really saying is there is obviously a structural shift in a significant portion of the market, and this is a portion of the consumer base and the demand side that is going to grow as time goes on. So looking across the industry over that 5, 10, 15-year period, in order to market products in the right way, there needs to be essentially a range of marketing materials out there that's done across a range of platforms to meet each consumer segment that are understanding each different thing about the product to ensure that your steak on the shelf is being marketed in the right way that keeps that demand strong. And I think that's where we, as AHDB, look into it, is that this is almost about supporting and stimulating domestic demand. And the key thing to do that is we need to understand how and why consumers make decisions, which comes back to Gen Z as being a significant portion of the consumer base and a future portion of the consumer base, given that age range, and why it's important for us to look at it as well. So that was me trying to take us from having a joke to being, this is the point of why we're having a joke about this.
But I think also we need to add in there that while social media is really important, we do see that these younger consumers, your Gen Zs, are more likely to look at using multiple sources for establishing their opinions on things. So we see that they are much more likely to use 4 or more sources than those aged 55 plus. But some of that is going to be coming down to the types of sources that they're using. So we all know that social media generally isn't particularly well regulated, is it? Anyone can put their opinion out there. So it's actually really important for our industry to put across a really clear, really trusted voice, if we are going to be using social media for targeting Gen Z in particular, that the information we're giving out is relevant factually correct, and that we are challenging things when it is being misrepresented, which is work that we already do in wider media, but perhaps also needs to have that clearer focus when it comes to social media too. Media campaigns, obviously marketing, they have their specific love pork, let's eat balanced, milk every moment. So they have their general campaigns, but then they also have targeted approach for your Gen Zs, which would be on social media. We do track that and see how it's performing. And generally it is getting really good results coming through from there. So it is about, we're utilising social media. Perhaps the rest of the industry could look at how they might be using it too. And then we can come out with a really clear and united front for addressing some of these topics, which are obviously really important to Gen Z, and for helping them feel that the information they're getting is coming from a reputable and trusted source. So I'd really be recommending people should be making use of social media and just see how we can help with maybe influencing these trends that are coming out, or jumping on the trends bandwagon to help promote red meat and dairy.
I think we've covered every single thing we could have covered there, which is brilliant. I think it's the first time on this podcast where anyone has put me on the spot and Martin on the spot and grilled us with some questions. So I feel you're kind of getting your own back, because we were in the office a few weeks ago and you mentioned it and I said, yeah, let's do it on the podcast. And I think you were a little bit surprised that we said yes. So I think you're kind of getting your own back slightly. So fair play to you. But thank you, Charlotte, for all of your insights. That was really useful. So if you want more information on anything that we've discussed in the podcast, we've got some articles online. We'll go into this in a bit more detail. But if there's anything specific that's relevant to your business and you want to learn more about this area and kind of discuss more of the information that we've got, then please do get in touch. We are more than happy to talk about this in more detail and get right into the depths of it. And to finish up, you may have already guessed the musical act for this week. It was Madonna. I think Borderline is my favourite Madonna song. I would say I'm committed to that. That is my favourite. Or American Pie. I forgot about American Pie. Anyway, I'm going to go and listen to Madonna. Thank you for listening. Hope you have a good week.